find my agenda is somewhat general, but I like to keep it that way so that the discussion can go in whatever direction it's led. Can we start with the probably can we start with Phoebe and telling us who you are and who you're representing, and then we'll go around, followed by James Brown and then Jed Holloway and then the council's team. Right.
Hi,
Phoebe.
thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Phoebe Juggins. I'm an Associate Planning Director at Your Tribe. Your Tribe is a PBSA developer with some active operational and pipeline sites within the borough of Southwark.
Thank you. James?
James Brown. I am a viability consultant, chartered surveyor and RICS registered valuer, and acting for Tribe, who I do various bits of work for.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Jed Holloway. I am a senior solicitor at Southwark Law Centre. I run the Planning Voice project, which represents community campaigns, but also does general sort of policy work such as this.
Thank you. Right, then the council's team.
Yeah, of course I'll start. Cameron Bradford here. I'm part of the Southwark Council as a Senior Planning Officer.
Juliet Seymour. I'm Assistant Director for Building Control, Planning Policy and the Historic Environment.
Janet Lee, Field Team Leader. Hello, Rachel Jones, Programme Officer.
Yeah.
Hi, Sasha Winfield Ferreira from Quintic Advisory, Viability Consultants to the Council.
Anthony Lee, Quintic Advisory.
Charlotte Brooks-Laurie, Head of Planning Policy. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I've just got a couple of general points that I want to just pick up before I go through my agenda. Dr. Lee, firstly, I just want to make sure that I've interpreted the results correctly. I'm looking at your, the Quintic results table in your Appendix 1. So I just want to make sure that I've understood. You've got, obviously we've got the benchmark land values across the top, and down the side, we've got a variety of forms of development. The high, medium and low in those examples, that I assume is referring to the rents.
Yes, to the rents.
Yeah, that's correct.
That's correct. Okay, good. And I see you do say that at the lowest rents tested, looking at lower zone 2, value zone 2 and zone 3, you say viability is more testing.
Yes.
Did you consider keeping the existing charge in zone 3, for example, bearing in mind your conclusion that the viability is more testing?
I think the decision was taken that because there wasn't much development coming forward in those areas, that setting different rates would not meaningfully alter either the viability of schemes coming forward or the income. So the decision was taken to adopt a more straightforward flat rate across the borough.
Okay. So you're saying that you're not anticipating a substantial amount of the sort of development in zone 3. Is that one of the points you're making?
Correct, yes.
Okay, that's fine. Mr. Brown, I'm going to come to you. I'm looking at your paragraphs 1.2 and 2.3 of your submission, and you tell me that the existing charge, talking about the existing charge, makes purpose-built student accommodation unviable, unsustainable, and prejudicial to fundability and actual delivery.
Yes.
What evidence do you have to support that view?
Well, the evidence that I would look at first would, apart from my experience of running several FVA's, financial viability assessments of actual PBSA schemes in Southwark. But my first point of information would be to actually look at what Quintic have done and presented, because I presume in these circumstances the evidence to substantiate that things are viable is the initial onus in terms of pointing to a CIL charge proposal increase is that needs to be proven to be viable. My experience of schemes, which one of which in particular I touch on in my evidence, which was considered in detail at an appeal, that forms some of my evidence. The other evidence is that I haven't been convinced by Quintic that things are viable and that the existing CIL charge can be afforded.
Okay, I mean, my difficulty, Mr. Brown, is that the council takes a completely opposite view. The council says that the market for PBSH is strong and it's very sustained in Southwark, and they give me a lot of figures about under construction 1629 bed spaces, consented 2666, resolution to grant planning permission 3434, applications in the pipeline 3580. Now all those figures would seem to support the council's view that actually there's a strong market in Southwark, which contradicts your view that it's not sustainable.
Well, if I put, I'm getting an echo. I point to, for example, CBRE, who are an independent in terms of this situation. I mean, they've recently reported that, and I quoted it in my evidence, that in contrast, London assets saw values fall by 0.8%. Now, that is a sign that the market is, I'm not saying it isn't strong, but it's weakening. And in Quintic's most recent submission of not sure what date it is, anyway, the most recent submission, they, for example, agree that operational costs, i.e. the cost of running,
we'll pick up those.
Have gone up.
Yeah.
And yet they've assumed that everything, all their other assumptions remain the same. Now, that must lead to whether they think the PBSA development is viable or not viable in various locations, it must mean that it's got less viable than it was at the very least, because if OPEX costs go up and everything else remains the same, obviously it's going to be less viable because the value of the PBSA will have gone down.
Well, that presupposes that everything was on the margins of viability at the time of the previous assessment. So, yes, residual values may have gone down as a result of operational costs going up. That simply eats into some of the headroom. What we weren't saying before was that in every single case, residual value equal benchmark land value, and therefore there was no surplus for a CIL. So yes, if you have a cost goes up, then by extension, the residual value will go down unless something else compensates. We're not saying that rents have gone up or yields have moved in, but clearly there is still headroom for the proposed rates.
So
May I add a point in terms of the scheme that Mr. Brown has submitted evidence on. In our responses to the representation, we did highlight that the position in terms of the increase to the CIL liability to that scheme, and that reflected a buffer or a surplus still available of 5.879 million when looking at the appraisal that our advice was formed on. And I'd also highlight that in that scheme, a full policy compliant contribution towards affordable housing as well as CIL was agreed to by the applicant. So that demonstrates that there is headroom.
Yeah, now I understand that, and we're going to come to that point now when we're talking about the transparency. Can I just ask the council, have you detected any very recent falling off with interest in PBSA developments?
The answer is no, and indeed at a recent committee there were 3 schemes which came through. We can give you the specific number of bed spaces that those equated to.
To name that, so there's 241 bed spaces approved for 301 to 300 feet Ilderton Road. LSE Bankside House had 1,945 student bed spaces. So that's already well over 2,000 just in 2 schemes alone. And then the third scheme was 452 PBSH bed spaces as well. So that's a significant amount just in one committee alone this year.
Yeah. Mr. Brown, I'm going to let you come back on that if you want to. The council,
yes.
The council, hang on, the council have produced quite a lot of statistical evidence which supports their view that that market is still strong and there is no sign of it tailing off. I just give you the opportunity to comment on that because you haven't produced any evidence that it is tailing off or that it's weakening.
Well, so I might defer to Phoebe in a minute because Tribe are one of the biggest PBSA actual deliverers in Southwark. And it's very important not to confuse the number of planning consents and the number of beds that they represent with how many actual starts on site have been occurring, because in a similar way to the C3 residential development world, you may well be aware that in London there are reportedly about 300,000 units worth of planning consents for residential, and yet the number of actual starts on site has collapsed. And I believe I did actually put some stats in my representation, but I'll have to have a look in a minute. But Phoebe has got it more in her head because they are. I'm an advisor and valuer, whereas Phoebe's company is actually observing the market immediately because they're building in it.
Okay,
Phoebe.
right, Phoebe, can you help us?
Yeah, I think it's probably just worth saying that I think that point is quite relevant, that there's a big difference between a council's 5-year housing land supply and their housing delivery test in terms of what the metrics are designed to do. And this is really no different. There is a difference between the amount of planning permissions that might be granted for all different kinds of development and what is actually commenced. And that pattern and trend has changed quite significantly over the last 5 years. Obviously, we are someone who is a developer. We go and get planning permission and we build out our developments and we operate them. But I can't speak for other landowners who might come forward for basically any kind of land use that they think is fashionable or in trend, get a planning permission and then do very little with it. So I think this reliance on the pipeline and perceived strength of the pipeline as part of a justification for that is quite dangerous, because it doesn't necessarily relate to the type of activity that will be seen over the next kind of few years, which is effectively what this CIL charging schedule is intended to do. It's intended to come in and then cover that for the next period until such a time as a local plan review or whatever it may be. I think what the point you made at the start, Mr. Holland, in relation to the kind of current situation and the viability challenges there and where we are today, what I can't see a huge amount of evidence of in Quintic's work, and that does possibly have something to do with the transparency, but since the CIL charge for PBSA was originally brought in, there have been changes in the council's developer contribution SPD, which has changed the way in which other contributions relating to PBSA are collected, i.e. there's been an increase in that because the council adopted a new SPD. I believe it was in 2025, but I'm sure an officer can correct me on that, where an off-site payment in lieu for affordable housing was set at one threshold and then increased. And it's not clear that increase has actually been really factored into the evidence that we've seen, because there just haven't been a huge amount of planning permissions that have been granted since that SPD was adopted. So I think it's difficult, again, to rely on historic data saying, well, everyone was fine before, when actually if you've put your payment in lieu up by 30%, we haven't seen the evidence of how that plays out yet come into force. So it's, again, relying on kind of circumstances that were very different in order to try and justify something you're doing today, which is, I think, a bit dangerous. And then associated with that, obviously, the Southwark PBSA policy looks for a direct let scheme, looks to either to achieve C3 affordable housing, which I know is a separate affordable housing valuations are put down separately, but again, the significant increase in build costs and the risks of that market in terms of registered provider activity has changed quite dramatically over the last couple of years. And therefore, again, basing it all on historic data is a bit of a dangerous trap to fall into, because what developers were able to do with C3 affordable housing blocks 5 years ago is not really the same as what's the reality on the ground for many developers today in the borough, and Southwark are kind of fully aware of this.
Thank you. Dr. Lee or the council team, do you want to come back on any of that before we move on?
Yeah, I'd like to just come back on the issue of completion. So obviously the council undertakes monitoring, and this is done on, in fact, a monthly basis as well as an annual basis, and the authority monitoring reports are up to date on that. And for 2025-26, in terms of completions, the proportion of student units, so this is when the GLA's ratio is applied, so this is actual units, student units accounted for 31%, which is a really high proportion. And we can see that, 2022-23, it was 37%. So, there is a consistent kind of pattern of schemes continuing to come through, not only on the approvals side, but in pipelines and translating through into actual completions on the ground. The second point I'd like to clarify is the Section 106 of CIL SPD was adopted in 2025, and it did include all the uplifted costs within the viability testing. So those are actually all accounted for. So that deals with that point. I'd like to pass over to Quintic, the other point.
Yeah, just to expand on that last point, in terms of, I think there was a suggestion there that we hadn't been transparent, but if you look at table 425.1 in the viability report, you'll see there that we have set out the costs included for the planning obligations SPD in full. So they are included in the assessment. And just to the further point in a similar vein, The 3 schemes that were recently at planning committee also included those costs.
Okay, right.
Can I just come back on that in terms of I appreciate that the SPD, when that was adopted, that took into account all the up-to-date costs, but it didn't account for an updated CIL charge because that hadn't been proposed by the council yet.
Well, that's the purpose of the viability study, to test both the cumulative impact of the SPD and the uplifted still rate. And that's what the still study does.
No, that's fine for what it does today, but the justification saying at the time that the SPD was brought out, that factored in all of the up-to-date costs. I'm not disputing that that's its own matter, but it didn't factor in this proposed CIL charge.
Well, it wasn't in place at the time, so
that's exactly my point. That's exactly my point. So you can't say, oh well, that SPD was fine because we've factored that in. I understand that we are where we are today, but I don't think it's possible to say that I'm not trying to say that the SPD is making things unviable. That's not part of what we're discussing today. But it's difficult to retroactively claim that SPD accounted for all costs in the way it was formulated, because obviously we're here today talking about a CIL uplift. But I can see that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point to clarify there is the section 1 and 6 of CIL SPD was also at the time subject to viability testing. The section 1 and 6 of CIL SPD was approved, and those costs which were in play at the time were also in parallel reflected in the CIL viability evidence. So, you know, there's been 2 lots of viability testing, firstly on the impact of those uplifted costs for the section 1 and 6 of CIL SPD. Those were then reflected in Quintech's viability study, and that's referenced in the report itself. So,
yeah, no, that's clear. I was just making it clear that the previous SPD can't have accounted for the current CIL uplift that is what we're discussing today, but I think we're clear on that. That's fine.
I think another point, and Charlotte, correct me if I'm incorrect on this, is that being section 106, it's also based on a case-by-case basis and a scheme-by-scheme basis, and so will be negotiated on each scheme as it comes forward on its merits. And so what we've allowed for in the CIL viability testing is the, not worst case scenario, but the full position that all of the charges as set out in the SPD are accounted for in our testing. But obviously on a case-by-case basis, these might not all be sought. Just to embellish that point, the section 106 and CIL SPD includes costs such as archaeology, heritage and conservation costs, which obviously will not be applicable to all sites. It just depends if, the location of that particular site and site circumstances. So we, they took a very belt and braces approach to the testing and included all of those, for the avoidance of doubt. And just one other point, picking up on Ms. Juggins' earlier comment, in terms of the viability testing, we have allowed for, as you can see in the typologies tested, for standard affordable housing and student affordable housing to be tested as part of the scheme delivered on an on-site basis. So with respect to the payment in lieu, that's sort of the next step back that an applicant would need to demonstrate if they can't deliver units on site. So what we've done is tested the policy starting position, which is to deliver the units on site with all the associated costs.
Okay, I think we've probably covered this sufficiently now. I want to move on to ask Mr. Brown just this. I don't want us to go over the scheme that you talked about at Ilderton Road. I think, is that right? Ilderton Road scheme and the appeal and the interesting discussions you had with Dr. Lee in relation to that scheme. But I just want to make sure that I understand the position on that. Your conclusion was that the scheme would not be viable with the policy requirements being met. What I'm not sure about is whether you thought the scheme was viable with the policy requirements being partially met. if you see what I mean.
No.
Did you reach a conclusion that actually the scheme wouldn't work if the policy requirements were met, or
Yes, because I produced a proof for the appeal that concluded that a viable payment in lieu on a what they call a totally or 100% direct let PBSA element was about £6 million. Now the client agreed, and I'll come on to that, to pay 20.7 million.
Yeah.
Now I can't prove it to you, but I'll say it anyway because there are some evidence sometimes is that there isn't any evidence, i.e. when nothing is being built, even though there are lots of planning consents, that is evidence in itself, but it's not a statistic as such. But that client, I can't really go into their rationale because it's confidential, but they are a fund, and they are now beginning to realise that they can't actually afford to pay 20.7 million. Sometimes I have to say that clients agree to things because they get, what can I say? They get a bit desperate in the face of planning discussions where they're facing the risk of ending up with no consent at all, or something which perhaps they might be able to go back in on and improve at a later date. There are other real world examples of this in Southwark. If you look at the PBSA scheme that was permitted at Sylvan Grove, where that was permitted, I think it was about 2 years ago now. Cushman and Wakefield have been desperately trying to sell it for about 2 years as a site with consent. They have been completely unable to sell it. Now, you could say, well, maybe they're asking too much money for it, but you would have thought by now that they would have cascaded down to selling it at whatever they can sell it for. But, you know, that's the reality of what's going on out there. And it does feed, I don't want to open up what we were talking about before again, but it seems to me that whilst I don't have the statistics, nor does Quintic, on what is the actual ratio of planning consent granted to actually things that are actually getting built. And I
set out already the proportion of completion, so we have that data, and that's regularly monitored. We also have pipeline data. I'd also just like to mention that this is an example that you have spoken to us about. So on that basis, I'm not sure if it's evidence that's permissible at this hearing.
Well, if you want to rule it out, and
yeah, I don't really. I mean, there's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of speculation, Mr. Brown, inevitably about the motives of clients, etc., which are really is not helpful to me for trying to decide if the council have got a case for increasing the CIL or not. It's helpful for me to know what your view is about the developer payment, but it's not helpful for me to speculate about other schemes or how much is implemented, etc. What I am interested in is the question of whether you did your own assessment of what the increase in the CIL could be, if any, because Dr. Lee says you've actually got all the assumptions that they've made available, and if you wanted to, you could have run your own assessment. Did you do that?
I didn't do that because I haven't got all of their assumptions, because, for example, going on to wheeling in transparency, I can't see what their cash flow timings are in their appraisals. I can't see what their purchasers' costs on the investment purchase assumptions are. I can't actually check the maths of their appraisals. I can't see their appraisals as per the Appendix 1 that you referred to earlier are really just a series of numbers. So I can't actually feed in all of their assumptions because I don't know all of their assumptions.
Okay.
And in my experience, going back, I'm not going to go into it, but the appeal scheme, knowing that ins and outs of that and having referred to it and presented it, I know what was. There's no point testing a higher CIL rate there when already the policy compliant requirements can't be met and not viable.
Just like to answer that, if I may, just in a headline fashion before passing over, but I would say that the assumptions used in the 2024 and updated 25 viability assessment clearly sets out the methodology and the assumptions used, and those are also further set out in the 2026 assessment, and they're the same. Obviously, there was a slight shift in one of those, but do you want to expand on those assumptions used?
Yeah, in terms of the points Mr. Brown made, purchases costs are dealt with at paragraph 430 of the report, timings 431. There were discussions during the consultation by email with Mr. Brown via the authority, and further information on sales timings were provided. So in our view, there's more than enough information there for Mr. Brown to run assessments of his own, alongside his own knowledge of live schemes in the borough that he could have relied upon. And I've acted in his role in other authorities on behalf of developers where there's been another advisor on the authority side, and I've been more than capable of setting up my own appraisals using the data that the council's advisor has provided. So none of this would have been a barrier to Mr. Brown to set up his own appraisals to his own assessments.
Okay.
Well, I don't believe I do have.
Mr. Brown, can I just, before you answer that, can I just come back on a point you made? You're saying, you didn't have any cash flows that you could use. Do you think it's reasonable to expect cash flows for a high-level CIL viability assessment? I mean, it's an argument that is often advanced, but it's quite difficult to see for a high-level CIL assessment how you can actually build cash flows in.
Well, I would reasonably expect to see perhaps a sample of breakout appraisals. Quintec and I typically, outside of this kind of exercise, use Argus software, which you can see everything that's going on, including the cash flows. If they could provide some breakouts, perhaps examples of some of their typology assessments, then perhaps I could track through and audit and check them. I mean, I'm not going to say that, I don't think it has been, or at least, and I still don't think it's incumbent upon me to carry out the same exercise that that Quintec have done. I presume in this particular context that primarily it's for Quintec to demonstrate and transparently what they have done, so that I can, I'm not sure that it's for me to replicate what they've done or try.
Okay. Dr. Lee, do you want to come back on anything?
Yeah, just very briefly. Yes, Argus is used for application viability, but when you're doing an area-wide assessment where you are having to do literally sometimes tens of thousands of calculations, if we were to use Argus, we would be burning through millions of pounds worth of fees. Literally millions of pounds. It would take some people full-time work. It would take them probably years to do the kind of work that you can do in Excel models. So that simply wouldn't be practical. And with regard to Mr. Brown's I think he's slightly limiting his role by saying he's just there to audit. I think the onus is, if you look at the Southwark questions, the onus is on respondents to provide evidence. Evidence very often in other representations includes providing appraisals if that's something that representatives want to do. So I wouldn't agree necessarily that the role of those wanting to take a different view from the authority is limited to simply critiquing the evidence that the council has. It's also supplementing the evidence base if that's what they want to do.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Can I ask you, Mr. Brown, are you content with the selection of typologies that has been used?
Can I know Phoebe has a comment on that with regard to testing
Typologies.
a typology that has on-site affordable housing, haven't you, Phoebe?
Your microphone.
Sorry, it refers to a point that was made earlier by Quintic, just about the typologies that are tested in where they all include the kind of first element of the policy cascade, i.e. in terms of testing on-site C3 affordable housing. Quintic, as well as the council, will be well aware that a number of schemes move past that cascade mechanism in complete accordance with the policy approach, simply because of site-specific constraints, i.e. the inability to fit two separate buildings on a site. Southwark is a very dense borough, a lot of building plots are very small, you can't always achieve on-site C3 delivery. And officers acknowledge that actually they do collect a significant amount of payments in lieu from this. So I find it I find it surprising that there's no typology that specifically deals with this scenario, which is a very common scenario on smaller, more constrained sites for the delivery of PBSH. And sometimes these are sites that actually couldn't feasibly be delivered for any other living use because they are so constrained, and their a future building footprint couldn't accommodate a kind of C3 residential scheme. So I just kind of wondered what the justification for not including that is. Obviously, I don't want to get back into the conversation on the SPD because that is its own matter. It's its own thing. It's been tested. It hasn't been through examination, but it has ultimately been adopted by the council without challenge. So that's just my kind of main point on typologies. And then if I can just make one very small point on the cash flow point, and I'm not suggesting we go back into that, but ultimately on some of these typologies where you have quite big schemes, the amount of money that these developments cost to build is very significant. And if you cash flow the build cost even in very slightly different ways, you end up with very, very significant impacts coming on the back end, depending on exactly how that spend is phased. And I'm certainly not suggesting that it would have been appropriate to test every single parameter and every single option in Argus, but I would have expected to see a kind of understanding of a reasonable assumption just to evidence that a reasonable cash flow could be applied to this, and the output would be in accordance with what Quintic are asserting.
Okay.
But I'm not expecting to need to open that again. Sorry, I just wanted to kind of mention
that's
that.
Okay. Dr. Lee, can you just pick up the point about smaller constrained sites not being represented?
Well, in the borough's experience, small sites aren't really very common, so it wouldn't be reflective of the type of scheme supposed to come forward. Just some other points in response to Ms. Juggins' comments. With regards to affordable housing, yes, there are some schemes that go from on-site to payments in lieu, but the modelling of on-site is effectively the same in financial terms as the payments in lieu. So the payments in lieu is derived from the financial equivalent of doing on-site versus doing 100% private. So to assume that it's more expensive to do payments in lieu is not correct.
Right. Yeah, I understand.
But I think the point on small sites I was making wasn't a small site in the traditional sense of a small site. It was simply a site that cannot accommodate two separate buildings, of which there are many sites being delivered in Southwark. I understand the point about the equivalency on the C3 affordable and the payment in lieu, but it also comes down to this kind of cash flow and borrowing point again. And actually, if somebody is building C3 affordable on a bigger site, that has to have a slightly different outcome at the end from somebody paying a payment at the end. But I can kind of understand the point that you've made, and I don't think it's appropriate to open up the viability circumstances of the SPD again.
Good. Okay, I think that's extremely helpful. Ms. Juggins, that's helpful. I'm going to move on to the yields, and Mr. Brown, I'm going to come to you on that, because you say that the average should be higher than 5%, and that 5% should be bottom of the range. What are you basing your 5% plus figure on?
Well, I referred to a mixture of things, including the Knight Frank yield guide.
Yeah.
And also the yield that Quintic, or formerly BNP Paribas, used in the example, the Ilderton Road scheme example, where I presented their appraisal. Now, since then, since last Q3 2025, the Knight Frank yields have increased, meaning the mathematical multiplier you apply to the gross rent to get to the GDV of the PBSA has gone down, but in Quintic's most recent response, apart from changing OPEX costs, their yields have stayed. Everything else has stayed the same.
I understand that, but I'm still not certain as to what your view about the 5% plus is, why you've come to that view, because I think as I recall from the evidence, the Knight Frank documentation talks about 4.5%, and quite interesting, I was looking at this Modus publication in this month, which I'm sure you're probably familiar with, the RICS Modus publication. That's got a section in it about student housing entitled From Niche to Established Asset Class. And quite interestingly enough, that talks about yields and saying in London they've stabilized at about 4.3%. So there seems to be a conflict between what you're saying at 5+% and the other written material.
So the Knight Frank yield guide and what the Modus, yes, that's referring to stabilized assets, meaning existing student accommodation that where that's been running for a few years, where they've managed to optimize the way they run it, the way they market it, etc., etc. It's a bit like a hotel. It takes 2 to 3 years from practical completion and first occupation up to what they call stabilization. And that is why in an appraisal, when valuing the asset at practical completion, as Quintic did on the example I gave at Ilderton Road, you have to factor in the additional risk that reflects the fact the scheme is not a stabilized asset. And of course, there are other aspects as to whether you're assuming the asset is prime and what determinants you're using to say whether it's prime or not. Is it just location, or is it the economies of scale offered by the size of the scheme, etc.? So the evidence, in conclusion, the evidence you've looked at, and the Knight Frank evidence relates to stabilised assets. We're looking at development propositions and policies that apply to development proposals and new schemes. They are not stabilised assets.
Okay, that's helpful. Dr. Lee, a response to that?
Yes, thank you, sir. A couple of points. There is a CBRE 2026 market outlook report, and they consider student housing yields, and they are predicting that yields will be moving in, i.e. compressing later this year based on recent activity. So that would support the yields that we've assumed. And with regards to stabilisation, clearly developers have the opportunity of bringing a stabilised asset to the market, so they don't need to build on a speculative base. They don't need to build with a operator on board up front. So many times these are modelled. They're not modelled with an investor already on the hook to buy. So that they're basically a spec development, which is why we include profit at certain levels. So by the time the developer comes to bring the asset to the market, they will have let the units. It will be a stabilised asset. Therefore, the use of a lower stabilised yield is not necessarily incorrect, as Mr. Brown has suggested.
Okay, Mr. Brown, you want to come back on that?
This then again, I can't help but going back to transparency and cash flows, etc. Yes, a developer could develop something and not crystallize its value or sell it at practical completion. They might hold it for 5 years, but that needs to be understood as to what treatment is being assumed in a cash flow. And if you can't see it, you don't know. The lower yield might apply if they sell it in 5 years' time, but then you've got to account for the holding costs on all the rolled up compounded development costs, which may or may not be covered by net rental income. Might take a while to get payback.
Okay. Right. I think we've probably covered that adequately, unless somebody's got anything they desperately want to say about yields.
Just to say that is a word of caution on kind of looking at, like, obviously London-wide guides and the categorisation is all we have, but Southwark does have a somewhat unique position in terms of PBSA development policy, whereby they do not require nominations agreements for direct let schemes, whereas pretty much every other borough follows the London plan approach of affordable student housing, and which is at a capped rent for a chunk of the development, and a majority of those rooms being subject to a nominations agreement. Now, if there has to be some benefit in terms of understanding the yield from having a permission from having a building with a nominations agreement, because that effectively is guaranteeing a chunk of the rental income for a number of the years. So having 100% direct let as a product has much higher risk associated with it than a product that has a requirement for nominations, because ultimately somebody knows coming into that a large proportion of the income is guaranteed. But I think we made that point in our representation letter as well.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, sir, can I come back on that very quickly? I don't know what Tribe do, and we're not obviously personalising this to a particular developer, but in my experience elsewhere with other developers, nominations agreements do not guarantee rents. They simply provide access to a certain institution. So I think it's somewhat misleading to say that a nomination agreement automatically is a rent guarantee, because that's certainly not the case in my experience.
Okay. Right. Operating expenditure. some revised figures have been produced, moving it up from £3,500 to £3,800. Are you satisfied with that, Mr. Brown, or do you think that's still inadequate?
I think on the basis of what I've already detailed in my representation response that it's insufficient. Step in the right direction. But you see, as you will appreciate, £300 per bed per annum as a cost increase, with all other assumptions staying the same. If you were to use a yield of 5%, is subject to what your purchaser's cost rate is gross £6,000 a bed diminution value, which is quite significant across, a 500 bed scheme. So that's why we've said, we're I know, and Dr. Lee will say that it's just reduced the headroom they had by the sound of what he said earlier. But we're just surprised that hasn't had a negative effect on the conclusion that the proposed CIL increase is sustainable. We would have thought that might well have impinged on it. But again, going back to transparency, we can't entirely see that.
As I interpret the results, it looked to me as though when Dr. Lee, when Quintec were producing what they described as their appraisals of what the maximum CIL could be for direct length PBSA, actually you can see an impact of the increased costs. So that is built into their figures. If I compare their figures, the Quintec figures, and the figures that were in the original viability update study, there is a difference, which I'm assuming reflects the fact that the operating expenditure has gone up. Is that right, Dr. Lee?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
I presume that means that more of the areas where they said it was more difficult to possibly meet the criteria, new charge, have expanded. The areas where it won't work has got bigger.
I think that's true to a degree. Yes, that's true. Okay. What would your figure be if you were doing this exercise, Mr. Brown? I see you've got £4,000 quoted somewhere in some of the material that I've seen from you. I think, is that the sort of figure you'd favour?
I think I would have said, I'm not looking at it right now, but I would say now 4,500 per bed per annum. And one of the reasons, this is an area where I believe I have provided evidence, and indeed evidence from Tribe and others as actual owners and operators. But the word OPEX costs can mean different things to different. I'm not speculating, I don't think here, but it can mean different things to different people. You often get operators, companies like Mazzino, who just operate the scheme on behalf of an owner. They will experience OPEX costs, electricity bills, managed staff, etc. But as an owner, which is what is relevant when you come to value PBSA, obviously you've also got the voids and bad debts to account for, and being sensible, you need to account for an annual sinking fund allowance for future major repairs. Now, those two aspects, voids and bad debts and future major repairs sinking fund, often get left out of OPEX costs, and they can be very significant. So I've already detailed that in my representation, but we're now getting on to well, it is somewhat transparency, because what I think often needs to be done is to see a build up of what a typical OPEX cost and ownership cost with respect to the single fund is, item by item, to get, because otherwise we're just dealing with a number that is unsubstantiated.
Okay. Dr. Lee?
Well, like Mr. Brown, I've dealt with live student housing schemes in London, and I don't recognise the £4,500 figure. So I've worked with Adara on several student housing schemes in Camden with a similar rent profile to the higher rent part of Southwark, and the OPEX cost, including all of the ownership costs, was 3,250 per unit. So while yes, it might be possible to spend 4,500, we are tasked with assuming what a rational operator in the market would spend, not a particular individual developer. We review a number of student housing schemes, ones that we're familiar with, ones that we've dealt with through the planning application process, and our figure that we've seen previously, and now the increased figure of 3,800, in our view, is more than reasonable.
Right. Okay.
I'm not disputing that it might be possible to spend 4,500 if you are providing a range of services that are atypical for a student housing scheme. So if you're providing a full room cleaning service and you're adding in communal gyms and all kinds of facilities that are typical, then yes, it will be possible. But in the main, those things aren't the kind of things that are delivered. And we have to reflect the normal development or the standard development.
I think, sir, I mean, we can debate this, or I think I've presented evidence, and I'm sure you will compare my evidence to whatever evidence Quintic have presented.
Yeah, I will. Thank you. Let's move on to cost of finance. Big difference in views here. Mr. Brown, you're talking about 8.75 to 10% compared to the 6.5% I think that Quintic use and have used consistently over quite a lot of CIL work that they've done in London, much of which I've seen at various stages. So we've got a big difference of opinion here, and I know Dr. Lee's point will be, one of his points at least, will be that development finance is very different to a mortgage, and it doesn't track the base rates in the way that is sometimes claimed by people who are objecting to their 6.5% figure. And I've seen your documentation from funders who are talking about the sort of figures that you're talking about. So I've seen that evidence. So Dr. Lee, I'd like you to respond to the points Mr. Brown has made and the evidence that he's produced.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, we've discussed this in other places previously, and my response has always been that one has to look at the wider market, not just the terms of a particular lender who may, for whatever reason, be a niche operator that only lends to certain kinds of developments or certain kinds of developer. And without full information on those operators, we can't tell what sector they're operating in. So that was the first point. The second point is that we're not, although we're assuming 100% debt finance, in reality, developers will not normally fund the whole development. They'll put in equity as well. So the rate reflects both a return on their equity and debt rate. So it's a blended rate. It's not necessarily the rate paid to the bank. I'm aware that this point has been discussed at appeals recently, and I think it was Mr. Brown who was actually at this appeal against Carson Jonas, I believe, and they produced evidence from a series of FVAs demonstrating that the claimed, I think it was 10%, Mr. Brown was claiming in that particular case that his claim 10% was far too high, and the typical rate in the view of those kinds of schemes was 7.5%. So I think there is convergence in viability assessments of around 6.5 to 7%. And I think Mr. Brown's 10% or whatever it is today is a bit of an outlier.
Okay, now, Mr. Brown, your figure's an outrider.
Well, I think it was 9% actually, and that was a residential scheme. But you can see all my evidence, and that includes another appeal decision, and they're not always consistent appeal decisions for whatever reason. But on a PBSA scheme that I did actually appear as an expert witness at as a hearing last summer, the inspector agreed with me that 9% all-in finance rate was reasonable. Now, I agree, development finance rates are not a tracker mortgage. However, there is a connection, there is an influence on with the base rate and SONIA. I can only ask you again just to look at my evidence, which includes, as you've said, evidence actually from lenders, and not just from a variety of schemes, different sizes, different types, C3, PBSA, co-living. You know, that is effectively from the horse's mouth. Now, with respect to, you know, the fact that developers do put equity in, I know this is the argument that some people put forward, that you know, and I've explained all this in my evidence, that a developer might borrow bank finance on 60% or 65% of total development finance, but then he'll need, or she will need, equity and mezzanine finance. Now, if Mr. Lee is saying that the bank finance would be 9% and that the rest of the finance is effectively free, which therefore takes into a weighted average of 6.5, well, I just did say that you know, equity and mezzanine finance is not free.
Now, as I understand it, mezzanine finance is quite a lot more expensive.
Yes.
Dr. Lee?
I'm just keen, sir. I'm not on an emotive mission here, but as with the draft NPPG recently, which talked about the potential of using a standard assumption to embed it into the system, we are just walking into a car crash of assuming assumptions that are just totally out of kilter with reality, and hence the delivery problems out there.
Okay.
I'm just trying to break out of that rut and be realistic.
Dr. Lee, you're not being realistic.
Well, I think what we face is in the applications that we review, we get possibly, I'm guesstimating now, possibly 5 a year from Mr. Brown, and the other 195 are from other advisors. The other advisors, they will correlate around 7%, 6.5 to 7%. Mr. Brown is the outlier. So based on what I experienced in the market, it's not reflective of what Mr. Brown assumes. We also, taking this back to the point around SONIA, SONIA has fallen over the last 3 years since the September 22 mini budget or fiscal event. So on that basis, funding conditions will improve over time. And we're not setting a still rate for today, it's a still rate for the foreseeable future. And rates are predicted to stabilise and to fall.
Yeah. Okay.
May I just come in again on this just use of terminology about
Certainly.
the market? Can we just be clear that when Mr. Brown is talking about the market, he's talking about evidence from actual funders, and when Dr. Lee is talking about the market, he's talking about evidence that is coming through financial viability assessments that are being produced to support planning applications, and that these two types of evidence are not one in the same. I'm not here to get into the what percentage is correct debate, but simply saying that other viability assessors give certain figures doesn't make it right or wrong, I think, is just the key thing here. And just because somebody else is willing, viability, we all know that on a site-by-site basis, financial viability assessments represent somewhat of a negotiation, and simply saying that other viability assessors are willing to submit, and other landowners and other people who prepare planning applications are willing to submit things at certain percentages, does not necessarily reflect what the market is doing, because the market for actually funding development comprises actual banks and institutions and lenders for which we deal with on a very frequent basis. And I'm not going to get into kind of any further evidence or speculation here, but what you see in FEAs does not necessarily represent exactly what funders are actually doing on the ground. And I think this point about Sonia's coming down and the likely kind of trying to project into the future what that might mean for rates and what that might look like sort of takes me on to this point on rental growth. And actually, if we're here today talking about a CIL charge that is going to be adopted today, it really does, in my view, needs to be based on evidence of what is happening today, not where we think things will improve to or get to in the future. So that's it.
Thank you. I think Dr. Lee will no doubt correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Dr. Lee's figures are based on current day costs and values, rather than projecting something in rental incomes in the future. Is that right, Dr. Lee?
Yes, it is right, sir, and that's the way this is always carried out. There may be sensitivity analysis undertaken, but the council has not based its decision making on the projected or sensitivity analysis. It's based on the current values and current costs.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I just make one very quick point in response to Mr. Juggins? Obviously, the government has set ground rules for these assessments. We have to operate within those ground rules, and if there is a problem with how they interface with the market, then that's a matter to take up with the Secretary of State, not with you, sir, with respect.
Good luck with that. Right. Abnormal costs. Mr. Brown, you haven't made the point that abnormal costs haven't been included in the work that's been done by Quintec or by BPNS Paribas, but some other people have made that point. I must say I'm always a little confused by that, because if there are abnormal costs, by definition, you can't standardize them and you can't put a standard figure in that you could justify. So my view has always been that abnormal costs, if there are abnormal costs identified, they need to be reflected in the price paid for the land, not in some arbitrary figure put in a viability study. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Well, not entirely, sir, because if you were looking at a site that's currently a tertiary office building, which has a large footprint, you may, in determining a benchmark land value, the hypothetical land cost, you're basing that on the value of potentially that as an office building, without being able to know if there are any abnormals in the ground, underneath the building, etc. So the benchmark land value may not have been able to factor in abnormals. I mean, I can't, again, don't want to use the word speculate, but it seems in London there are usually some abnormals, which is a bit of an oxymoron. Usually there are some abnormals, but there are.
Yeah.
Can I just comment on that, sir? I mean, obviously viability PPG is quite clear that the risk to developers is already accounted for in assumptions in the price that developers pay for land. So it is quite normal here with the viability experts for that to be picked up at a site-specific stage as opposed to actually being lumped into viability testing as a whole, and that's in accordance with the PPG on the matter. If you want to
Yeah, so the PPG does make it clear that when I take Mr. Brown's point that if you have an existing secondary office, then it has a value based on what it can be used for, i.e. letting out to people and they'll pay you a rent. But the decision that most landowners will take will be that they'll bring that site forward for development because it's not optimising the use of that land because it's not fully occupied and the rents are subpar, and therefore there's a strong incentive for the landowner to bring a site forward for development. If there's something in the ground that was not known before, then ordinarily you would get a developer would come in, they would do their site testing and do the investigations, and if there is some historic use based on their due diligence, they will reflect that in the price paid for the site. And the landowner can either stick with a stranded asset with ever declining rental income and lower occupancy, or they can press the button and take whatever the developer is prepared to offer. When it comes to viability, if we were to try and second guess what contamination would be in every single site that might come forward for student housing in Southwark, we would be here for the next 20 years doing site investigations to try and preempt what they might be and how they might be dealt with.
Yeah.
And it is meant to be a proportionate assessment of viability, and that wouldn't be proportionate.
No, I agree. I accept that point, and I don't think we need to explore that any further. Rental growth, again, that's something that we have touched on. Dr. Lee, you've told me that your figures, your cost and value figures are not assuming rental growth. Mr. Brown, you seem to think that they were. I wasn't quite sure why.
I don't think I actually said that, but no, I'm pretty sure I haven't.
Okay.
I think if it's the only thing was in relation to Mr. Lee talking about future conditions improving, whilst I'm not disputing what the evidence today is based on, this kind of overall narrative of Sonia coming down and that will improve things, trying to use that as justification for what's been agreed today, I feel is not necessarily the most robust. But I don't think that I didn't necessarily mean that the incorrect future projection was being used in light instead of today's rates. I wasn't accusing the evidence of being incorrect. It was just the narrative and the sentiment.
Yeah. Okay. Affordable housing valuations. I'm not quite sure of your position on this, Mr. Brown, because you say that, and probably your argument is based on the fact that you say you can't interrogate the figures adequately without all the working figures from Dr. Lee, but you say they can be overly optimistic. Are you saying the figures that Dr. Lee has used are optimistic, or do you have any evidence that they're optimistic?
You'll understand, sir, that I got the Quintet response in landscape form last week, and I see they've expanded in that and on what they say here in connection with 3.6C, which is in turn connected to what I labelled as 3.6 in my original representation, that they say this, and I'm quoting, I'm reading it here. The social rent values in the appraisals range between £326 per square foot in the highest value areas, Zone 1 locations, and £213 per square foot in the lower value areas, Zone 3 locations. Now, again, yes, you're right. Transparency. I can't see how they've actually arrived at those figures. But what I would say is £326 per square foot for social rent is not achieved, is off the scale. It's not even in Zone 1. The actual location of a social rented unit it is partially relevant, but the way social rents are worked out is formulaic. And in fact, I don't know if Phoebe were allowed to forward the paper you and I were discussing yesterday from the government, but they've actually got a cap on what a social rent can be. And for a 2-bedroom flat, for example, it's I could say, well, I don't know if you want to hear the ins and outs and detail, but it's about £215 a week per bed. Now, if you capitalise that through, you get to about £200 a square foot without any grant funding, which is the typical situation.
Yeah.
So that should, in theory, be the kind of cap value, the capped capital value throughout Southwark, because the formula immediately takes you to the cap wherever you are.
Yeah.
So the difference between £326 a square foot and 215, which Quintet referred to, is quite a significant difference. And if it was a 35% affordable provision and 70% of that was social rent, that could be a big number. So this is about disagreement with specific assumptions as well as transparency issues.
I'm not sure that I've got the documentation that you were talking about, that you were quoting from 3.6C. Did you say, what did you say?
Can I just come in there? Sorry, sir, just to clarify, it's a very important procedural point, actually. The evidence that Mr. Brown's referring to is on the website, and it has been totally within the 4-week period. So that's on the council's webpage. So I think Mr. Brown might have been saying that he was sent it by Ms. Juggins a week ago, but in terms of the information being publicly available, it has been on there from the outset, and it has not changed. So that is, as it has always been. So the schedule you're referring to. So the schedule you're referring to, I believe, Mr. Brown, is in the consultation response. It's one of the annexes to the consultation response, which is item 3. Do you want to just refer to the specific paragraph you're referring to within that? It was Quintec's response to your...
Yes, I said it was 3.6C. Or is it on that page?
Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Have I seen that?
Yes, you were sent all the documentation by post, so you have this. So this is within the consultation report, which is item 3. There's a number of annexes which make up that item. So there's a consultation report on everyone's representations, and then there's a specific annex which is Quintec's response to Mr. Brown's letter.
Yeah.
So that is in, yeah. So the document you're looking for is essentially a table, and it takes Mr. Brown's paragraph numbering from his letter and addresses them point by point within there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now I've got that. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry,
Mr. Brown. Yes.
Just my point being that I think it would only I would have thought Quintic should explicitly detail where's £326 a square foot. How's that been arrived at? Where's it come from? Evidence.
Well, if you take the I mean, you referred to the rent caps, I think, a second ago.
Yeah.
I think if memory serves me correctly, you mentioned a figure of £215 per week as being maximum rent for what was that was for a 2-bed. I think
Off
you said.
the top of my head, yeah.
Yeah. So if you run the rent cap for a 1-bed at 173 per week, that generates a capital value of 335 per square foot.
Well, I would imagine that a 2-bed. I mean, look, it's again. I don't know if the onus is on me to prove things here, but I would have thought the onus is on Quintic to demonstrate a fair and reasonable assessment based on an average unit, which I would have thought was more close to a 2-bed.
Well, for a 2-bed, it would be a similar value because the rent cap.
I don't know how could you. I haven't seen how you've got to that value. You're telling me it's the same value, but
there are a set of formulae set down by MFCLG that we've applied.
I know that.
Relative household earnings and relative capital values, and that's how we calculated it.
I'm not asking how. I need to see how you've calculated it. I can't see it. Where is your calculation? Because I think it's gone wrong.
You think the arithmetic is wrong?
Well, it can't have led to £326 per square foot, in my opinion.
It depends entirely on the mix. So if you had a mix that was comprised of only 3 and 4 beds, it would be much lower. But a mix that is weighted more towards 1 and 2 beds would be entirely appropriate at 326.
Yeah, you're probably right, but I can't see any of your calculations to arrive at anything for any mix.
Okay, I think we can agree to disagree on this one. You haven't got the figures, and Dr. Lee's explained where he's got his figures from, although you might not be able to see the arithmetic. Let's move on to strategic sites. I know you haven't made this point, Mr. Brown, but couple of other people have made. So I just wanted to ask the council what the position is. I know you've got area visions, and I think you've got opportunity areas like most of London, and you've got specific site allocations detailed in your Southwark plan. I think I'm right in saying you don't have any strategic sites defined as such. Is that correct?
So the Southwark plan has a total of 86 strategic sites, and applications for student housing have come through or been approved on 31 of those. So the strategic sites are responsible for delivering a large portion of Southwark's housing supply. And that's obviously set out against the annual target which Southwark has of 2,355.
So you're saying you've delivered student housing on what you regard as what you identified as strategic sites, and those developments have paid CIL at your current rate. Is that right?
Yes. And just to clarify, none of the strategic sites allocated in Southwark plan specifically allocate student housing. So what we have actually seen coming through is a very significant proportion of the residential allocation on those strategic sites being accounted for by student housing. And indeed, on several of these sites, the percentage uplift is over 100%. So it removes all of the residential allocation, has switched to student. And I think aligned to that, we've also seen, and you'll have this in the evidence, a number of sites have actually switched from conventional residential over to student. So that demonstrates, that this is a well-established market in Southwark.
Right. When you say strategic sites, are those what you describe in your plan as site allocations?
Yes, yes.
Okay, right. All right. Then I've understood the position. And this takes us to the point about housing delivery. Mr. Brown, you think that in fact, if you withdrew the proposed increase, you might actually get more housing delivery in Southwark, presumably because you're saying that with the proposed increase, student housing developments won't come forward. Is that your point?
Yes.
On what basis, may I ask?
A logical basis that if you make things more financially difficult, then the less likely they are to come forward.
Well, obviously, as a general point, that's true. But the evidence seems to be from Southwark that actually these developments are coming forward at the current rate. And Dr.
What is that rate? What is the rate of as a percentage of planning permissions? Could I ask Southwark?
When you say rate, do you mean completion rate? Is that what you're talking about?
What I'd it's not for me to ask really, but it's more that Southwark should wish to investigate and report how many of the planning consents that they have been granting since over the last 6 years for PBSA have either been built or have recently started on site.
So we have that data, Mr. Brown, and I can tell you that in 2025-26,
no, over a longer period, like the last 5 years, because you may have had.
Okay, I can give you the percentages.
Period where.
So in 2022-23, the proportion of student units, and this is with the GLA ratio applied, so this is actual units, it equates to 37%. All units, that's in 2022-23. In 23-24, it's 22%. 22-25, it was 12%, but then in 25-26, it was 31%.
So you say, look,
can I just check though? Is that the proportion of from your total housing delivery completions? Are you talking about that being the proportion of that total that is PBSA? Because I think what we're suggesting is that what is your rolling total of planning permissions containing PBSA and other things, and how many of them have actually been either, what I would call committed, which is where a meaningful start on site has been made and, CIL and other things have been collected, or actually completed, because that's the real test. As I said earlier, lots of people get planning permissions for things with no viable way of being able to deliver them, and I would have thought it's not in the council's interests to see lots of planning permissions and no activity, because it takes your time, it takes a lot of officer resource to process these applications, and if you don't have anything to show for it a couple of years later, that's not particularly helpful. So I think it's that understanding of the pipeline, how much of that is actually does that get delivered? Is there a nice neat correlation that tracks all of this? And it's not to say that it's the council's fault, but I think the point that we would make in terms of how that affects housing delivery is if the council is assuming certain receipts from payments in lieu or delivery of on-site C3 affordable, that is a component of some of this PBSA development, which is the stuff that the council really wants, that they've said in their evidence in terms of what the council is trying to achieve. Then that doesn't happen if you don't then get the PBSA that's kind of facilitating that. So I think that's just the question, really. What is actually being delivered of all of that?
So I think completions is obviously the evidence on the ground, isn't it, of what's actually coming through the pipeline. And obviously those are the figures I've just provided. And in fact, based on what has been approved, I can tell you that in 2025-26, of all the units approved, student accommodation with the ratio applied was 27%. So we can only see that impact in terms of the proportion of student sites and stuff that is going to increase, because obviously, as you've said, the pipeline will continue to flow through to completions. In terms of schemes, our monitoring of schemes has shown that the vast majority of schemes are actually compliant, so they are achieving the full 35% equivalent in terms of the payment in lieu, and we have that monitoring evidence. So I think, arguing that there's not buoyancy in the market or continuation of that pipeline is simply not the case. I think the other point to make in terms of payment in lieu is that, site allocations are made to address housing need in the borough as a whole, and that includes the need for affordable housing and for family housing. And by family housing, our policy is really clear what we mean, and it's about having larger dwellings with 2+ bedrooms, 3+ bedrooms, and 4+ bedrooms, which is set out really clearly in the policy. The simple fact is that whilst, yes, the council does get payment in lieu, that is not delivering the size of accommodation in the same way on site that something, that could be developed or brought forward through kind of conventional housing. So what we're seeing is a kind of skewing of the position in terms of the delivery and how these sites are actually building out. I can give you evidence that we have where actually some of these strategic sites, which weren't anticipated to have the level of student housing, have been completely 100% or 50%. The residential allocations used up by student housing. So the evidence is very significant.
I heard all that, but it doesn't really address my simple point that it seems, not that we've got these stats, but it seems to me from what I've just heard at length there, that you haven't got them either, is of all the planning permissions for PBSA that have been granted in Southwark over recent years, how many have been built and how many are being built? Now, you used the words "are going to be," and that's not. How do you know that? I don't know. And yes, there are a lot of consents out there with policy compliant payments in lieu agreed on paper, but are they being built? I'm just concerned for all of our sakes, not just tribes and various other developers, but if we're increasing costs, development costs, in a statistic context where we don't actually know what percentage of consents being granted are actually getting built, I think we've all got a problem.
Well, we do have the data in our background paper, in fact, so that's already set out. Cameron, do you want to talk through?
Yeah, so based on the monitoring data, which you can find in the background paper, we've got for the monitoring period from 2019 to 2026, of all the schemes that have been monitored, for 31 in total, there's 4,009 in the region of 4,000 schemes, that bed spaces that have been built. We've also got under construction at the time of this monitoring and the background paper being done, of another 1,629 under construction. That's also, we've got consents in the region of just shy of 4,000. And then we've also got stuff at resolution to grant in the region of 3,300 as well. And a current live applications, 3,000 on top of that. So that totals to 15,401 bed spaces. Either built in that pipeline.
How many consents have lapsed during that period? I mean, to say that you've got 4,000 beds built, of which Tribe themselves have actually built close on 900 beds, I should think, haven't you? Kentucky, Old Kent Road and Ilderson Road, the other Ilderson Road scheme. But in that period since 2019, what I'm not hearing is how many consents on average existed, because some may have lapsed, of course. It sounds like you've got 4,000 unimplemented consents. Anyway, look, we're getting into speculation here, but all I'm saying is, for your benefit and everyone else, all stakeholders' benefits, we really ought to have statistics on how many of these planning consents for PBSA have been built.
We've got 30% of approved student schemes have been completed in the last 6 years. And I think that your point on lap schemes, that applies to any type of development. I think the statistics are very clear that we have an extremely buoyant sector with ongoing applications which are in the pipeline, applications that have recently gone to appeal with significant numbers of student schemes coming through. And despite other sectors may have suffered more, but the student sector has continued to maintain that buoyancy. So, we presented a range of data here to you, which I think illustrates that very clearly.
30%, you say, completions in the period 2019 to 2026 doesn't actually sound like a very large statistic to me. It means 70% have not been completed. The majority. Why is that?
It's certainly where we because of the CIL. So I think that let's take this back to what we were meant to be talking about, which is the CIL a critical factor in this decision making on whether schemes should come forward or not? It won't be that the CIL developers suddenly woke up and said, oh well, because I've got to pay 1.9% of build cost for CIL, I'm going to down tools. There'll be various factors around why schemes come forward at particular times. And I think we're trying to stretch the point a bit too far here in terms of will the CIL, if the CIL is not increased or will the CIL reduce, will that suddenly make developers bring schemes forward? And the answer is clearly no. If that's what's been holding them back, then they've been absorbing build cost increases annually, general build cost inflation annually, at 3% over the last at least 5 years. Why would a sudden reduction of 1.9% mean that they could absorb those other costs but not this cost? And it just seems to me that it's because it's levied by the authority to pay for the infrastructure that these schemes will require and need those people to live in them, that this is suddenly seen to be a blocker.
No, if you took that position with every cost, you can't just say, oh, well, this represents a small percentage of development cost, therefore we can increase it by 100% or whatever the percentage increase is, because obviously it's a bag of development costs. If all costs were just treated in that fashion, then you'd have ludicrous across-the-board cost increases, wouldn't you?
Yeah, if it was 100%.
It's just your attempt to sort of camouflage the extremely large percentage increase in CIL charge that you're proposing.
No, it's not extremely large. You just said 100%. It's 1.9% of development costs.
No, I said what is the percentage increase, which is not, the answer is not 1.9. What is the answer? It's about
the increase as a percentage of cost is 1.9%.
No, I'm not asking that, am I?
I don't know what you're
asking. I'm asking simply, what is the percentage increase proposed in your CIL charge? It's going from circa £150 to about £250. That's a big percentage, isn't it?
That's an irrelevant metric.
I don't think
a big percentage. Cost increase.
It's a percentage, but do you, Mr. Brown, do you accept that Dr. Lee's point that actually the percentage increase in development costs is very modest, under 2%, and therefore that is not going to be the decisive factor for a developer as to whether they actually implement their permission or not? There will be other much bigger considerations in play. I think that's the point that Dr. Lee is making.
Well, it's a bit, I don't dispute that it is statistically 1.9% of total development costs, but if all other development costs, which they are also increasing, it's a bit like saying, well, all these other costs are increasing, so let's increase this one by what is 80%. it just makes it more difficult. Makes development viability, it compromises development viability. There's no point increasing something just because you think it doesn't make a difference. If it doesn't make a difference because things still won't come forward, then you're not going to get it, are you? You're not going to even recoup the money. There's no point increasing it, therefore.
One of the advantages of CIL, of course, is that it's an upfront, it's a cost that is non-negotiable. So you as a developer will know what you've got to pay for CIL, which presumably you will take into account in your development assessment of what is viable and how much you can afford to pay for the land. Isn't that true? That's one of the points.
That is absolutely true. The point I would make on this is that if you have a defined packet of things that is being asked of the development, which include all different kinds of costs that relate to what is actually being built, that, CIL, which, like you say, is a fixed cost that is non-negotiable. You know exactly how much it is, and you know exactly when you're going to be paying it over the course of that development. It's very nice and easy cash flow. I like it. The challenge that you have is that on all of these schemes that have been tested is that if there's slight site-specific things that come up during planning applications where developers might financially viability test them, what's the first thing that goes? The first thing that goes and is negotiated is the Section 106. Now, if Southwark like collecting either payments in lieu or commitment for on-site delivery for affordable housing, and that is the only policy tool that you have to renegotiate that viability position, if that's the only flex, because like you say, CIL is a fixed charge, your building regulations are fixed, you can't skimp on sustainability measures and all these other policy considerations. If affordable housing is the only thing, I just can't see that it's in the council's interest to pursue CIL in lieu of the affordable housing, because there is the council has its own programme of affordable house building. It's in contract with two different main contractors. It's got a series of 7 sites bundled up that it wants to fund. So I just can't see why it's in the council's interest to, and that's not for me to answer, but that's the only point I would say, is that whether it's putting the charge in and of itself may not be putting a specific developer off on every single site, but the challenge is then that you end up eroding other benefits that the scheme may otherwise have been able to afford. And if a developer sees there to be too much risk from not being able to comply with that, then they walk away from the whole thing because the viability becomes marginal.
I mean, this is a very familiar argument that, well, if you're imposing CIL, then what will actually end up losing out is the affordable housing. That's a familiar argument. But of course, the council, I guess, would say, well, we've taken that into account, that what our affordable housing policy is, and we've looked at that and we've assumed that policy will be implemented when we've done the viability work. I think the other point that I think is relevant is that, of course, CIL payments, actually, there's a benefit derived for the development industry and for the community from the CIL payments, because they're paid for infrastructure, which helps the developer and the community as a whole. So that it's not an expense which doesn't carry with it any benefits.
If I may just come back to a couple of the points that have been made. The first point I'd like to make is that the essence of several policies in the Southwark Plan are really about achieving a mixed and balanced community. Essentially, what's happened is there's been a significant proportion of purpose-built student accommodation coming forward, which is essentially undermining the ability to provide that mixed and balanced community. And what we mean by that is providing, a variety of homes, affordable homes of mixed tenures of different sizes. And that's set out very clearly also in the London Plan Policy H10. It's in Southwark Plan Policy SP5, and it's in Southwark Plan Policy SP2. So that's one of the key points. The second point I'd like to just come back to, your question, Ms. Brown, about expired planning consents. Only one has expired. 7 granted have yet to start, but are still within the 3-year expiry limit. And that's out of 15 schemes which have been granted since January 2021, which is only one. So I don't think that there's really grounds to state that, you know, we're relying on kind of essentially empty figures, because that simply isn't the case.
So can you just repeat those? Since January 21, there have been 15 schemes that have been granted planning permission, and only one of those has lapsed.
Expired, yes. And only 7 are yet to start. So, but they're still in the 3-year period.
Okay. So half haven't been built.
But they're still within their 3-year period. So you cannot say that those are expired schemes. Only one has expired.
But everything rolls along, doesn't it? So it's a snapshot statistic in time. Half of the consents granted have not been built and one has lapsed. So more than the majority have not been built, in fact.
What you can't say, Mr. Brown, what you can't say is that the half that haven't been built yet won't be built.
I didn't say that.
No, I know you didn't say that, but you know that the statistic isn't helpful if you assume that. I think it's quite useful to know that 15 schemes have been permitted and only one has lapsed.
Mm-hmm. There's also 4 sites currently under construction, actually on site currently. So again, that's showing that we're having, you know, the pipeline is being maintained. I don't know if anyone on the team wants to kind of add to that.
Well, that just takes up that previously quoted figure to 2,229 from 1,629. So that does show a significant uplift.
I think we've probably explored this enough, and I've got basically all the information that I wanted from this hearing. Is there anything, anybody else? Mr. Brown, do you want to make any other points that haven't been discussed today?
No, thank you.
Phoebe, have you got anything that you want to pick up? No. Anything the council or Dr. Lee wants to pick up?
No, mate, so.
I'll make one point, sir, and that's just that in terms of where the council is, they have looked at reconsidering the balance that the CIL regulations require you to look at, which is the requirement for the delivery of infrastructure balanced against development coming forward. And so the current CIL charging schedule was considered back in 2017. And what's happened in the interim is the picture of delivery of purpose-built student accommodation has ramped up. And so in terms of the balance being considered, it is now tipping in terms of considering the requirement to deliver more infrastructure to support the purpose-built student accommodation units coming forward. And the regulations recognise that there isn't just one balance, and obviously this is in the council's hands to consider what is the appropriate balance to ensure that you know all aspects are met, and it's not to the exclusion of all other requirements that you deliver affordable housing and affordable student. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, right. If there's nothing else from anybody, I'm going to close the hearing. Yes, Mr. Holloway.
Thank you, sir. Just 2 small points from me that I did pick up in the written consultation response. Firstly, just potential lack of clarity around the asterisk referring to student housing nomination at £0. That really is intended to cover the affordable student housing. And while affordable student housing will be within the nomination housing, there is nomination housing that may not be affordable. So as a point of clarity, it might be better just to change that definition. And secondly, that definition refers to rental levels set below an average of £168 per week. I just think the reference to the use of the word average there is potentially confusing and maybe has the potential for, I don't know, a bit of gaming perhaps. So I think maybe that could be refined. And finally, it also refers to the 2020 SPD, and it should refer to the 2025 SPD.
Thank you, Mr. Holloway. I'm sure those points will be picked up by the council and addressed as needs be. Thank you. Well,
Minor points I appreciate. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your attendance, everybody, and your helpful comments. I'll go away and I'll probably produce a report within, say, 2 to 3 weeks' time. So that's my time. Thank you very much, and thank you to the administration at Southwark for organising the hearing, and I wish you all a safe journey home if you're not at home already.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.